Hello, everybody. The photo that we will be analyzing is taken by Steve McCurry on September 11th, 2001. As you can see, it's a photo of the Twin Towers collapsing after the planes hit them. It was published by Magnum Photographs shortly after the event occurred. So to provide some context for the photograph, September 11th is the most impactful moment in modern American history because it dictated the next 2 decades of American foreign policy and also drastically shaped the way that Americans view their own safety. So what happened is Al-Qaeda terrorists led by Osama bin Laden hijacked 4 different airplanes with the goal of crashing them into prominent American buildings. So 3 of the attacks were successful and crashed into the Pentagon and the two twin towers. And one attack was unsuccessful and crash landed into a field in Pennsylvania. Almost 3,000 people were killed on 9/11, including first responders and firefighters, and over 20,000 people were injured. And as I mentioned before, it had drastic impacts on American politics and foreign policy. A little bit about the photographer, Steve McCurry. He's from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He's a photographer, freelancer, and photojournalist, and he's won many awards for his photography. He's most famous for his photograph of the Afghan girl with bright green eyes that many of you may have seen, as it was published in National Geographic magazine. His photography generally focuses on wars, and as you can see, he's shot many different wars. But he focuses on something very specific, which is how war impacts the people that live in these countries, in these war-torn areas. And he says that he wants his photography to show how there's a human connection between everyone. An interesting fact about him is that he was accused in 2016 of digitally manipulating his photographs with Photoshop. And he didn't deny these accusations and instead claimed that he no longer considered himself to be a photojournalist. Instead, he considered himself more to be an artist and working as a visual storyteller. But it brings up an interesting discussion about the role of a photojournalist and how much responsibility they have to make sure their images are real. The photo we chose is not digitally manipulated, but some of his were.
The circumstances of the photo are kind of special for the McCurry himself, because he, as a New Yorker, was a direct witness of the events and lived it as a common civilian and not only as a photographer. McCurry said that to do his work as a photojournalist was important to distance himself from the situation to a certain degree. However, this was a special occasion, because this time the event was, quoting McCurry himself, in his own neighborhood, his own house. So all the emotion became something difficult for him to forget for a long time. The photography is hence an immortalization of all of this, not only the general memories of the event, but also a record of his experience, along with the experiences of many other people around the world. Pass. However, the photo is not only impactful because of its meaning, but also from a technical standpoint, the composition makes the photo more powerful. First of all, you have the contrast that is formed between the elements, like how the straight lines of the city and the solid texture and color of the sky are interrupted by the falling smoke and the trees of the tower, like an eruption. The vertical lines of the tower also create a contrast and generate attention, which usually in photography symbolize instability and power. Also, the tower itself acts at a middle vertical line of the photo, which means that the perspective lines generally meet there. So the gaze is automatically transported to the tower. All of this, as said, helps to create a powerful photo. Pass.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the photograph's purpose. So we know that the attack was historic and at the heart of the US. So it was very symbolic and is a huge memory of trauma. And photography is also really important because studies of the brain show that memory has an affinity for still photography. And so there's a much stronger impact for iconic still images of highly memorable, in this case, physically and emotionally traumatic events on the brain. And so the brain essentially remembers these memories better. And this can be studied through this image in particular and the media saturated environments that photojournalists contribute to. So now I'm going to play this video and Steve McCurry can tell us a little bit about that.
My pictures from 9/11, I think the images that tell the story and convey what it was like is my views that really show the entire site. This enormous field of destruction and these tiny little humans, these little men, these firemen and relief workers trying to find survivors, trying to do what they were doing, and it was futile. It was this task which was impossible. Looking at the coverage of 9/11, the video and the photography, the still photography, I always think that still photography tells the story so much better. There's that moment frozen in time. You can look at it, you can stay with it, you can come back to it again. It burns into your memory. It's something that you can't forget. I would think my pictures tell that story of this epic destruction in a place which was sort of my home, my
So after the video, we see that Steve McCurry really wanted to take these images to not only help the American public remember, but also help the world remember. And this is a great example of a flashbulb memory in which episodic and source memory appear tightly melded so that the subjects or witnesses remember not only the event, but where and how they came to know it. And moving on to the photograph's history and reactions, as we said, it comes from Magnum Photographers Collective, and it was displayed in a book called New York, September 11th, along with an array of other September 11th photos of the devastation. And we recently had the 20-year anniversary of the event. And McCurry's reaction and the public reaction are both really important because not only is McCurry American and the image is obviously very sentimental for Americans, but the world also had a strong reaction to this. So McCurry actually took the photo up on his roof of his office, which he would always see the buildings every day. And so now this was personal. It was happening in his own backyard. And after seeing this tragedy, he actually saved the picture and didn't look at it for 10 years in one of his file cabinets. And the public reaction was kind of similar in that because this was such a hard thing to look at, the public and news outlets tried to kind of censor some of the images that were being put out there. But obviously, we still remember the event today, and it just shows the power of still images and the power of photojournalism as something that directs how people think and how they remember, and it tells a life narrative.
So the photo documents the enormity, the chaos, the emotion of 9/11 on every scale, from panoramic views of smoke rising over New York skyline to close-up pictures of people's anxious faces. Now, as you can see from the graph, we can see that around 93% of people, which is the overwhelming majority of people, were old enough to remember exactly where they were and what they were doing during the moment of the terrorist attack. And so this tells us that this has been deeply embedded in people's memory and has been profoundly personal for each person.
Okay, so various of very nation's fundamental institutions, including periodism, was changed by this attack. By the time foreign terrorists attacked the American mainland, journalism was already in the midst of a sweeping communications revolution that was transforming the industry. Eye-opening new technologies had erupted, fundamentally altering its economic and financial structure. A new cast of characters with competing political outlooks and objectives had begun to occupy the airways and dominate the headlines. In the old days, the process of reporting a story was usually the result of gather, sort, and report, in that order. First, you gathered the information, then you sort it out, meaning that you check the facts and edited the copy, and only then you report the story to the public. In this new era we are nowadays living, we have flipped the sequence because now we gather and immediately report, no sorting or editing needed, or even a check in these new platforms as Twitter, Facebook, and so on. And as it is shown in this graph, these attacks led to increase the coverage of foreign policy and global conflict on the network evening news of the New York, but less coverage of domestic issues or drugs, crime, and so on.
Ultimately, we see through Stephen McCurry's 9/11 photos that photojournalism is really important because it's part of the mainstream media that influences and alters remembered history. And through his angles, we see how ethos and pathos really play a part in how we remember historical events. And because this lived on in the memory of the US and the world, this affected future relations between the US and the Middle East. Thus, still photography really is the best and truest way to capture a frozen moment in time and tell the truth and preserve it in your memory.
So now we should pass to the reference we use to make this work. And this is the end of our presentation. That's all.